What we're looking at in this webinar is the transformation of politics into the digital age. We need to find out how to do politics better, both globally and in this country. And the tragedies that happened last night in Manchester, which is on everybody's mind, shows us how sick our politics is globally and in this country, and the divisions that have taken place over the years. And in all sorts of ways, we've got to find how we can improve how we do politics so we can reconcile conflicts in peaceful ways. Now, the digital revolution presents challenges to us, challenges of opportunities to have a greater citizen democracy, challenges of involving our politicians and educating them on what the implications are, but also dangers, because big data means we can be controlled more and we won't necessarily get the open democracy that we think we might. So to take us through some of these issues, we've got David Wood, who's with us at the top. You can see him in the middle. And he's going to start now talking about this and looking at how politics will change in the digital age and how technology, progressive technology, may help to do that, and what the dangers are and the pitfalls and how we may or we might avoid them. So I'm going over to you now, David, to make that presentation for about 20 minutes. Then we'll come back and take questions from everyone in the audience. Anyhow, David, over to you, and thanks.
Well, many thanks for that introduction, Francis. I think this is a very important topic. Hopefully my screen should be visible now as well. Don't worry, I'm not going to talk party politics here. I'm not going to say things about which politicians people should be voting for. That's not the kind of change in politics I've got in mind. I'm talking about the change in the overall system of politics. And to be frank, I'd rather I wasn't talking about politics at all. At heart, I'm somebody who is fascinated by the possibilities of technologies, including exponential technologies, to significantly improve everybody's human experience, to boost human flourishing. And since that provides the context for what I'm going to be talking about, I want to start by just taking a few minutes looking at some, to me, very interesting news stories from the last few weeks, 4 to 6 weeks, of what exponential technologies are on the point of doing in terms of improving lives. So let me click on here. You should be seeing a news story from a few weeks ago about significant improvement in treatments for that terrible disease of cancer. The headline is that cells can be reprogrammed inside our bodies, in some cases to fight cancer, via, in the subtitle, biodegradable nanoparticles, allowing doctors to reprogram immune cells while they're still in the patient's body. So that's one example of a technological improvement that could significantly improve our human health. Another reason why human healthcare is in such trouble is it's increasingly expensive to develop and test new drugs. But in this second news story, there's an account of how artificial intelligence, which is much more sophisticated these days than before, has the potential to investigate the mechanisms for drugs against various diseases much more quickly. The headline says that this AI can do in a day what currently takes months. It highlights the work of one startup company, Atomwise, which has a very interesting video on its website showing how it explores in multiple parallel computations all happening at once what the effects of various drugs might be. I'm also very interested in the work of another AI startup, In Silico Medicine, which looks at drugs that are known already to be safe and which are used for some conditions, and it looks at how they might be applied elsewhere. So 2 examples of exponential technologies improving human health. And then as for the health of the planet as a whole, I like this story recently about, it turns out, the largest solar farm in the world situated, who would have guessed, in Tamil Nadu in southern India, which has been operational for now 6 months. It's a massive size of 10 square kilometers, hosting 2.5 million solar modules. Those of you who have looked at solar farms know there's often an issue with them becoming dusty and their performance deteriorating. Well, this system has got a network of robotic tools to clean itself daily, and these tools are themselves solar powered. What's perhaps most remarkable about this installation is it only took 8 months for the whole thing to be built. And if we compare that with heavier energy sources such as nuclear, which can take years or even decades to get up and running. Of course, this is only presently looking after a fraction of the energy needs of India, but if we look around more widely, there's more encouraging stories. Here's a story from Futurism.com. Germany just smashed an energy record, generating 85% electricity from renewables on the 30th of April, a few weeks ago. That's combining wind, solar, and hydro. In terms of other technology, which is improving our power without necessarily requiring more energy to do it, I just want to highlight briefly a couple of stories about new kinds of computer chips. Often we futurists talk about Moore's law, about how the central processing units in computers are getting more and more powerful on a trajectory. Well, here are new kinds of hardware. On the left, I'm showing so-called TPUs, tensor processing units, which have come from research into the requirements of modern artificial intelligence, deep learning. It often uses a system called tensor processing, which have been done recently on GPUs, the graphic processing unit, with great success. But these new hardware designs are, it says, between 30 and 80 times as efficient. And so it's going to allow even more access to the great intelligence of deep neural networks. On the right-hand side of that, there's a different kind of chip. It is a two-dimensional QPU, quantum processing unit, which is one of the most exciting and interesting developments I've seen in the field of quantum computing. And Google, a different part of Google, is talking about they're going to have a 7x7 array of these qubits, calculating by the end of this year in a way that will outperform for some calculations even the best of our traditional supercomputers. So what does all this mean? It means that we are closer to fulfilling a mission, which here I'm highlighting from another startup based in London, DeepMind, whose mission is if we can use hardware and software to solve intelligence, to get access to greater power and intelligence, then we can use that intelligence to solve lots of other issues. So that's the kind of introduction. I am passionately interested as a futurist in the potential of exponential technologies, artificial intelligence, nanotechnology, genetic engineering, new green technologies to improve humanity. And I wish that was all I needed to talk about. But the reason I'm talking about politics today is because politics, for better and for worse, interferes with this development and interferes with this deployment. I say for better and for worse because there are both good aspects and bad aspects to that, and that's the main bulk of the remarks I want to make. So politics is there in part to set incentives that differ from what might happen just by short-term commercial incentives of private funders. Politics also sets regulatory frameworks which govern how these new technologies might come into being. Politics sometimes sets subsidies. We'll talk about some examples of subsidies shortly. And politics tries, in some cases, to prevent market failures. It tries to intervene in markets and say, this is what might happen if we just leave things up to the leading commercial companies of the time. But, you know, if we intervene, we can have better results. And last but not least, politicians, governments take advantage of some of these technologies in its own applications, which again can have a big impact on social and human experience. Things like use of this technology for surveillance, keeping an eye on more of us more of the time than ever before, keeping an eye on what information we can read. Many government bodies are in some ways trying to censor or restrict what we can see around the world. Then there are technologies of compliance, whether it's subtle psychological technologies such as nudging, or more overt technologies, including locking people up or imprisoning us in various ways. And last but not least, many of these technologies are used for war fighting, for, again, for better, sometimes often for worse. So before I talk more about the kind of bad aspects of politics which interfere with this process and need to be fixed, just in the interest of fairness, I want to spend a few minutes highlighting my view of some of the greatest hits of politics in the last 100 years or so. I'm not anti-politics by any means. I look at the way politics, central government have time and again led the way in investing in important new technologies ahead of the time whereby commercial funders would do the task. The internet, much of modern smartphone technology, for example, the GPS satellite positioning system, many other aspects of infrastructure and science have been benefiting hugely from central funding led by governments. So that's a great success. I also applaud some of the times that governments have stepped in to break up large monopolies and to insist on a more competitive landscape. I vividly remember about 20 years ago, Microsoft insisting that its own browser, Internet Explorer, was a completely integral part of its operating system and couldn't be removed. Governments around the world said, no, we don't believe you, separate it out, and that enabled a much more competitive marketplace and the growth of alternative browsers such as Firefox and Chrome, which got much better and indeed led Microsoft to develop better browsers. Governments also take the lead often in fighting against fraud by people who would otherwise make false and misleading claims in advertising, and they therefore protect the consumers against problems which the consumers might not otherwise find out about for many years. We can look at the way governments have intervened in imposing safety regulations. I particularly like what happened in the car industry. Go back 20, 30 years, most of the car industry was saying, you know, consumers don't want to pay extra for safer cars. They all think that they'll somehow be safe. If we are going to make our cars safer with crumple zones and so forth, it's going to cost a lot of money. We're not going to do it until the government said, oh, yes, you will. We can look at the way in which governments, politicians insisted on better hygiene systems. Probably the biggest impact on public health over the last century has been in the growth of improved sanitation, pasteurization of milk. And last in this, I'll pick out the way in which government in this country, the United Kingdom, funded the National Health Service again and again, often in ways that didn't make short-term economic sense, but made a great deal of sense socially. So these are the successes, but equally, there's all kinds of bad news from politicians getting involved and failing to, in my ways, set the right subsidies and set the right regulations. If we consider more about the clean energy, what I'm showing you here is two energy systems. The one on the right benefits, the fossil fuels industries benefits from subsidies which have been calculated by no less a body than the International Monetary Fund as receiving the equivalent of subsidies of $5.3 trillion in 2015, and just as high, I believe, in subsequent years as well, in part because of straightforward subsidies and in part because of failure to set a proper tax price to cover the negative externalities. And as people point out, this implicit subsidy exceeds all the health spending of all the world's governments. So that's a case where the government has set subsidies in part because they were captured or too heavily influenced by one particular industry, the fossil fuel industry. In contrast, if we look at the wind farm industry, for a while, there were subsidies available, but when the Conservatives came into power in 2015, they said, well, we're going to remove these subsidies because we don't like the way these wind farms are covering beautiful countryside. So an example of bad use of politics. We can look also at the way that the politicians have been captured by not just some of the energy industries, but also by the military industrial complex in the way that there are lots of interesting uses of new technology for weaponry. There's a campaign we can talk about in terms of killer robots that's illustrated here was actually a robot that was used to kill a sniper in Dallas who had run amok, killed lots of policemen, and the police in turn sent in this robot with a bomb on it because they did not see any other way of disabling the sniper. So he said, the Dallas police chief, there were no other options available to them. So we might think might be a case in this one situation. Other campaigners are more worried about what they call lethal autonomous weapon systems, some of them powered by drones, Currently, there's still some human involvement in most of the decisions for striking. Many people are saying that's too slow. That puts countries, governments at a competitive disadvantage. Where might this lead? Well, here's one rather grim scenario. You can put your own pictures on there of your own least favorite autocratic politicians, but there is plenty of scope for misunderstanding and accidental triggering of weapon systems with horrific consequences. So politicians are, in some sense, often at the beck and call of the arms industry and also of the finance industry. I won't have time to walk through this, but there's plenty of examples in which the financial industry developed innovations which superficially seem to make sense, but which led all of us into a near meltdown a few years ago, not in the weaponry sense, not in the sense of going to war, but our financial system nearly melted and lots of people suffered hugely as a result. I'm not saying that all regulations are correct, far from it. I'm pointing to this example here of a regulation from earlier in history when the automobile industry was for a time in Britain held up by regulations which said that cars could not travel more than 4 miles an hour, or in some cases even 2 miles an hour, and needed to be preceded by somebody waving a flag so as not to frighten the horses. It seems that many of the politicians who approved this measure had invested in the railways and they were worried about their investments suffering. This particular example, this picture, by the way, is a reconstruction, as you can guess. It was illustrating another example of an industry which has been subject arguably to too heavy regulations or outdated or inappropriate regulations, namely the GM food system. This Guardian columnist in this case points out that although there's been no evidence that genetically modified crops pose any intrinsic hazard, the regulatory scheme is so restrictive that in Europe only one such crop has been approved. And I would highlight this as an example of another political failure. So in this case, the failure goes more widely. It's a failure for us to have a proper scientifically based debate. There are, of course, multiple sides to this story, but overall, what I see is there were lots of emotional content which dissuaded politicians from taking the scientifically literate answer. And if we're looking here at a semi-humorous depiction of regulations about bananas, of course, we have to think of another politician who has, in my view, helped to undermine good political debate on a very important topic. This is Boris Johnson, who, as reported by one of his former journalist colleagues, Martin Fletcher, when he was a journalist, when he was in Brussels, led the way in spreading humorous but misleading stories about EU regulations. He was sacked, Boris Johnson was sacked in 1988 for fabricating a quote, but that didn't stop him. He kept on going with lots of stories which Boris himself described as just sort of, he was chucking rocks over from Brussels into the UK, and gave him a rather weird sense of power, seeing what the reaction was. As Martin Fletcher has said, and as Boris Johnson hasn't denied, Johnson seized every chance to mock or denigrate the EU, filing stories that were undoubtedly colourful but also grotesquely exaggerated or completely untrue. And what this is leading up to is a whole environment in which a lot of debate is just sheer toxic. Of course, there is fake news, which we'll talk more about in a moment. Fake news on social media, but arguably even more pernicious purveyors of fake news are some of the country's most popular newspapers. This is from an analysis published a few months ago, looking at headlines in all of Britain's leading newspapers and saying, you know, there's more here going on than reporting the news. There is, frankly, fanning the flames of hatred with story after story after story highlighting one side of the argument about migrants and immigrations. So if I were to summarize what I've said so far, I see that politics is a necessary part of society in providing some steering on elements that we shouldn't just leave to the free market, shouldn't just leave to technologists and entrepreneurs to develop as they see fit. But sadly, that set of regulations is often outdated. It's based on a lot of unscientific evaluation or outdated evaluation. The people charged with doing the regulations are often captured, to use the phrase, by interests which spend a lot of money, whether it's the oil industry or the armaments industry or other vested interests in the press. The debate has been confused increasingly by fake news. Politicians are often unable to talk meaningfully or sensibly about these important topics of exponential technologies and the implications. And indeed, the electors, as a result, are left out of their depth too. But if that is the problem, if the problem is that exponential technologies aren't able to have their full beneficial effect on humanity because of weak politics, possibly the same exponential technologies could get involved in improving politics. And that's the notion of politics 2.0 that I briefly want to explain before we move on to more of a discussion. Politics 2.0 isn't just an empty phrase. I use it very deliberately by analogy to something I lived through earlier in my career as a technologist, which was the era in which Web 2.0 was a real thing, which attracted more and more attention. So the difference between the first web from about, well, the first time that people were browsing the web about 20 years ago, and Web 2.0 from about 10 years ago, wasn't just in the number of people online, it wasn't just on the number of sites online, although that increased hugely. It was in the nature of the discussion that took place. Initially, the web was something that mainly people read, and it was written only by a few experts, and it moved into an era in which more and more people were involved in sharing their opinions as well. So instead of the content just being centrally published with a little amount of user-generated content, there was much more collective intelligence from blog posts and from user reviews. And if we look just quickly at the difference between what we might call politics 1.0, echoing Web 1.0, and politics 2.0, currently we have a small number of recognized think tanks or gurus who push out information to others. We have the vision instead of politics 2.0 of more of the intelligence of the network actually coming and rising to the surface, switching from the online material being more like a library to being more like a conversation, having much more of interaction, changing away from the innovation coming just from political parties to having much more of the opinions of users, voters from all walks of life. But to enable this to happen, it does need a step up in technology, just as the Web 2.0 needed a whole bunch of new technologies that nowadays people have forgotten, but they were very significant at the time. It's going to be the same with technology enabling new politics. So the vision here, we'll move from the current situation in which regulations are often outdated, regulators are often captured and so on, into a much more attractive 2.0 in which there's a real wisdom of crowds, not in the sense that crowds just go mad, but in the sense that's been explored by lots of writers, an intelligent crowd in which there is lots of independent analysis, in which people are genuinely curious, can generate better solutions than any individuals within that crowd, in which there's real-time fact-checking of dubious information, in which we individuals have our human intelligence supplemented, amplified by artificial intelligence, in which we end up with electors not being viewed as despicable or dumbed down, but which all electors are smarter, more informed, more connected via this technology. So that is the vision. And to be frank, I've been talking about that vision for a couple of years, but also to be frank, not seeing too much of that. And if anything, in the last couple of years, things seem to be going downhill instead, in which there is more surveillance, more companies such as Cambridge Analytica are studying what each of us are reading and writing and liking online, and are serving up custom messages, allegedly, to many of us to change our opinion, and in which we can say there are still a small number of wealthy, powerful individuals who are increasingly able to deceive electors, so that in America, so many people who would benefit from increased public health care nevertheless vote for a party, the Republicans, who have pledged to take away that health care from them, bizarrely. So that is what we're seeing. And I'm worried, frankly, because although the technology has the potential to take us into a better situation, I'm seeing politics getting, rather than more insightful, getting more angry and more violent. And what I worry about in particular is that the same exponential technologies that I spoke about earlier, which have the potential to make our lives much better, also are having a lot of bad effects in their wake, which could make politics even worse than at present. And I'll just pick one example here, which is the way that technology puts more and more power into smaller and smaller groups of people. And these people who happen to be the winners of this scenario do very well, but the rest of us who aren't part of these very successful companies increasingly struggle. We have a more precarious existence. And I'll illustrate that with this data, which I picked out recently from the Financial Times, a nice comparison of the three largest companies in Detroit, Motor City, in 1990, and the three largest companies in Silicon Valley a few years ago. And the comparisons interesting because the revenues of these companies are almost the same, but the number of employees is, in the Silicon Valley case, about 1/10 as much, and the market capitalization, well, in the Silicon Valley case, it's 30 times as much. And this is one illustration of an increasing winner-takes-all scenario and growing inequality, which we can see around the world too, by the way. Many of you may have seen this so-called elephant chart. It's an illustration of what's happening with globalization around the world. The elephant has just been drawn in by some clever person who says that's what the curve looks like. If we take that away and briefly explain what's going on in this curve, on the horizontal axis we're seeing, and the vertical axis, we're seeing how much people's income has changed over a 20-year period. So the higher up you are on that chart, the more your income has grown. And horizontally, what we're seeing is how wealthy you were to start off with, or how much income you were receiving to start off with. So far, on the far right there, the super rich have done very well indeed out of this. Their salaries have gone up. They are the winners. Actually, the super poor, they've done a bit well. There are many fewer people in absolute poverty than before, although there's still too many people in relative poverty. The middle class in developing countries such as India and China have done pretty well too in terms of growth. But there are more and more and more angry people who are the poor, or indeed the middle class in rich countries, who are left behind by this transition, increasingly angry. And if this exponential technology keeps on doing what it is without proper government oversight and redistribution of wealth, I feel the situation is going to get worse. It's impacting not just people's wealth, it's impacting people's health too. And there's a very worrying statistic coming out from America, from these pair of, one of them is a Nobel Prize winner in economics, husband and wife pair, showing that actually the mortality, the likelihood of you dying if you're in your middle age, early middle age, 45 to 54, it's actually going up in US, whereas in most other countries it's still going down. UK's got a slightly worrying trend in the middle there. And the cause of this increasing mortality, the cause of this increasing likelihood of dying, in part it's bad diet, in part there's diabetes, but even more remarkably it's increase in drug addiction, in alcohol addiction, in liver disease, kidney disease, and in suicides. So that is what lies ahead. More and more angry people who may be tempted to put their hands on weaponry of one sort or another, like this rather wretched person in Manchester who got angry with the world in various ways and sadly destroyed the lives of at least 22 people last night. But you know, as technology becomes more powerful, there is increasing ability for people with less and less intelligence to do severe damage to the world, either by nuclear weapons or by getting their hands on bioengineering, or by, as North Korea have threatened apparently, to detonate electromagnetic pulses and destroy much of our infrastructure, or cyber attacks of one sort or another. So it's even more important that we move rapidly from our current state of rather inadequate politics to a better politics. Why aren't we getting there? I believe we need a more detailed vision. We need a more compelling vision where to get there. And maybe we can cover that in the Q&A portion. So I have more that I'd love to say. I feel quite passionate about the importance of improving politics. I do believe that if we spell things out more clearly, we can get more people actively applying their insights into combating some of the issues. But let's pause here and move into an open discussion.
Okay, would you like to stop sharing your screen, David?
Let's do that.
Okay, I was worried there because I hid my camera and I didn't know how to unhide it, but I discovered that when you unshare your screen, I come back, so that's good. Okay, that was really a great presentation, David, and it was a masterclass on how to use slides, actually. I will use that to show people because they were wonderful slides, so thank you for doing that. We're getting some questions up, but please put other questions up as well. Let me start with the first one that Maxine asked, which is a sort of important question because you're saying, you know, big data in a way and the new technologies could take over so much of our lives and take over everything. And Maxine's asking, to what extent can citizens determine the pace at which this change takes place? And the reason I'm asking that if we did that nationally in the UK and we wanted it to take place slowly, in another country it was going quite fast, we might find ourselves at a disadvantage. So to what extent is the citizen empowered to do that? Or are they the victim of the fast pace of technological change on a global basis?
So I think we collectively have a responsibility to educate each other as much as possible. We are often out of touch with what the possibilities are for this technology. And when we do try and find out more about it, often we find some quite misleading information about it. There's a lot of gee whiz kind of scenarios, wishful thinking about what may or may not be possible. So one of the steps I think is utterly critical is a transformation of all of our education. And when I say education, I don't just mean for school children, I mean for education for everybody, as we should be able to find reliable bits of information about how these systems work and how they could be improved. I think that there are encouraging examples. There are many people who have contributed already ideas on improving some of the political structures. I think it's just the start of a much bigger revolution of what I call polytech, the technology of politics.
So do you think that, education is enough? I mean, if different countries do change at different paces, won't there be an equalization process? And would that equalization process be a good one, or would it be a bad one?
So one part of education is to be able to realize when people in other countries are actually doing things better than we're doing, or in some cases when they're doing them worse than we're doing. They make an experiment and it goes wrong. So the first thing we can do by looking at an international perspective is we can learn. And thankfully, there are some countries who are applying some experiments in one form of redistribution of the fruits of abundance, which is the universal basic income schemes. So we don't all need, every country in the world need to experiment with that at the same time, and we can take advantage of what's going on there. We can look at what some countries are doing in terms of transforming their own education system too. So I think we can learn a lot from that. I think it also means that countries can't actually become too conservative in the use of technology. Any country that tries to say, hey, we're not going down this route, we're going to go back to the older industries of the 1950s or the 1970s, they may have a kind of stability for a while, but they will increasingly be outcompeted by what other countries are doing by applying more robotics, by applying more artificial intelligence, by applying new materials of nanotech, and applying synthetic biology and so forth. So countries will have to move to keep up, and I welcome that.
Okay, Fong?
Yes, I have a question here. What would it help to bring in the politics to zero?
How would it help?
How could it help? What could it help? You know, just because you said that now we were in the situation that we could go back to politics zero. It's not great.
Yeah,
If
so it means
up
even
to 2.0, how would it be better?
so. Can I briefly share my screen one more time, Francis, to try and answer that?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Let me try and find the right button to do that. Share screen. I think my next slide, if I can do that, walks through more practically what would be involved in this practical vision. I've already mentioned that we need fact-checking systems so that when politicians come on TV and make various claims, then straight away we are informed when they are contradicting what they said previously, or when their facts that they talk about are at variance with what's generally understood to be the case. So that's a kind of a cornerstone of a better intelligence. And we have to know which systems we can trust. And already some people of some political persuasion say, well, we can't trust that Snopes, because as we know, Snopes is a Democratic Party-funded website or whatever. So we have to work hard to establish the integrity of independent fact-checkers. I think we must also hold more people accountable, frankly, that when people make false and misleading claims, if they do it in advertising, they're already often penalized, quite rightly. If people make false claims about the financial situations of their companies, they are often held accountable. But when we see politicians tweeting pictures such as the one on the left, I don't know if you can see the difference between these two pictures. That was the original picture, and we know it's the original one because it's been on the internet much longer than the second one, in which one Dutch politician, Geert Wilders, photoshopped in the face of one of the leaders of another Dutch political party, the Dutch Social Liberal Party, and Geert Wilders tweeted basically saying, look, if you vote for this party, you're going to get people in favor of Islam dominating the world. Freedom can go to hell. There was some quick retweets and likes before people found out what was misleading about it. And Geert then said, oh, you know, it was just satire. This was just a joke. You know, the democracy thrives on satire. I think this kind of thing is very irresponsible. I think we need to fight much harder on more accountability. Accountability, which again, we can guide with our collective wisdom. I think we need to learn also on how to think more critically, rather than just send people lots of facts and say, here are the facts, this is what science is. Actually, science is not a body of facts. Science, much more importantly, is a way of thinking about possible facts. And we need to encourage people on this so they're able by themselves not to be so misled. And then there's a point which I made earlier about the need for educational systems in which we gather as much information as possible. One of the things I've been involved in for the last 18 months is a project, H+pedia, which takes its inspiration from Wikipedia, which is in itself a remarkable piece of work, but it's to try and capture information which maybe even Wikipedia is not able to accept for various reasons. So whichever system it is, we need to have better systems to keep politicians up to date. We have to push hard as well for greater transparency. One of the things that's made open source such a powerful tool and technique is the fact that it is indeed open and shared, and we should be campaigning much more for openness and much more in terms of monitoring systems as well, so that when people say here is a regulation, it's designed to have such and such application, then we can look at it and figure out more quickly, is this really having the benefit or not? So these are some things I think practically in terms of what Politics 2.0 will have in mind. What we need is for people to get behind individual projects to push some of these bits of technology forwards. Sadly, there isn't a lot of money often behind this, which is one reason I don't think it's flourished as quickly as the Web 2.0 technologies, because there was huge amounts of money behind that. But, you know, I think there's many of us who may be at the stage in our lives when we have at least some bandwidth that we can deploy in a voluntary basis or on a non-profit basis to make these technologies come into acceptance more quickly.
Sorry, I'm asking, but what you said before, it just looked like that the Politics 2.0 would help us to have some more accountability, thinking, training, educational transparency. So like the process should be better, but what is the real benefits to normal people like me?
So the benefits will be that politicians take better decisions. Instead of taking decisions which actually benefit a small number of people, the crony capitalists or the press barons or whatever. All of us will get benefits. And in particular, I would see there's going to be more investment more quickly on the two transformational technologies of exponential technologies, more investment quickly on healthcare that not just tries to patch people up when they're ill, but technologies that will prevent us from getting ill in the first place. In particular, more investment. We're doing some, I don't think we're doing nearly like enough onto understanding the brain and ensuring that the mental issues, which more and more of us suffer from, can be addressed quickly. So if politicians would prioritize spending on these things, if they would take the decisions that would actually benefit society as a whole, judged from a scientifically neutral point of view, then I think all of us can get a vision of a better society more quickly.
Yeah, okay. So it is an ideal situation.
Yeah, okay. I think I'm hidden at the moment, and I'm not sure how to get me back. But never mind.
I see you.
You can see me. All right.
You're on the big screen.
Oh, I am. That's great. Okay. I can't see me, and that's probably good as well. You talk about what politicians should do, but there's a difference between what they should do and what they do actually do. And Maxine says, why do politicians fail to see the opportunities of the new technological transformation that could take place? I mean, is there a cultural lag? Do they live in a different age? What can we do to actually enable them to understand what is happening and engage them in it in a more creative way?
So politicians do take their cue from what they see people talking about. So when politicians see that lots of people are interested in a particular topic, if they get feedback on these topics from the doorstep, or if it's often in the media, then they start to pay more attention to it. And so thankfully, some politicians now are taking some of the technological implications more seriously. More of them are talking about the risks of technological unemployment, the risks of a greater inequality with the benefits of untrammeled development of some exponential technologies just going to the rich. So more of them are talking about, well, maybe we should look at universal basic income. Early days, and it's nothing like getting the attention it deserves. So if we can learn to talk intelligently and fluently about these topics, then politicians will get to hear about them more. And by the way, this isn't just about essays. It's not just about academic postings. It's about humor. It's about drama. It's about short videos as well. And we can all apply our skills. Some of us may be skilled in developing the technology. Some of us may instead be skilled about marketing the technology. And if more people get behind highlighting the possibilities of this, gradually we'll see politicians responding to it as well.
Evan Parker, who is very keen on seeing education change in the direction of 2.0 as well, argues that politics 2.0 is not unlikely unless we have education 2.0 first, and we have education for the digital age as well. How do you react to that?
I completely agree. No, education is in its present format because it's basically an evolution, a simple evolution of what society needed maybe 100 years ago, and it's evolved a bit. We need much more focus on critical thinking, much more focus on creative solutions, much more focus as well on encouraging people to be curious enough to understand why people have different points of view, rather than just quoting facts at each other and trying to overpower each other with facts. And there's always apparent facts that will back up any argument. We need education to stimulate us in bridge building activities as well. So indeed, education is the key. Transforming education is the key to getting a better politics. But we can't wait until education is completely transformed. We must look to do what we can to develop apps and new processes, and in some cases, new legal systems as well, in parallel with improving education.
Okay.
Yes. So there is a question about direct democracy. Is it part of the vision of Politics 2.0?
So it's part of the vision of Politics 2.0 that the wisdom of everybody is taken into account in reaching decisions. I'm not going to say personally what I think is the the right way to decide all decisions? I think that's a hard question, but I think there's still a role for representatives, definitely, who have some responsibility to take decisions on behalf of the rest of us. But more and more, they should be guided in the decisions they take by the conversation amongst the citizens as a whole. In terms of reforming how voting takes place, I'm very much up for discussions of that. I'm by no means a fan of the first past the post system. I think that puts far too high a barrier to new minority ideas entering into Parliament. We should be revising quickly the discussion, reviving quickly the discussion of how we can have a practical system of proportional representation. But overall, it's can we have a better discussion in which the best ideas of everybody can float to the surface rather than the loudest voices and the most powerful vested interests dominating that discussion.
David Wilcox, who is involved in a project called Network Cities, is wondering if we can get this discussion going and get it going in central London, where he's involved with an RSA, Royal Society of Arts group, looking at the network city. Have you considered, in terms of Politics 2.0, how that impacts on how we design our cities, network city, how big data can influence that, and tell us more about the way we behave and what we do than almost any other piece of information, whether it's elections or referendum or focus groups, all put together?
Yeah, so absolutely. The ability to collect data from a whole city should allow smarter decisions in simple things like traffic flow. If your navigation software in your car is aware of where all the other cars are, it will avoid navigating you down the quote usual route on one particular day because it knows that for various circumstances there is a jam there. So in similar ways, there are all kinds of other decisions which would result in better outcomes if the decision-making systems had access to up-to-date information. So I'm a big fan, as I say, of what exponential technologies in big.
Yes. So, sorry.
Risk is, of course, that much of this data isn't easily owned or accessible just by us as individuals. It's often owned or manipulated by.
It looks like David has sort of frozen a bit. Maybe he'll come back in a minute. Can I say, well, we're waiting to see if he does come back. Adolfo, you've asked if, because you're new to this platform, and so we all are, we're all experimenting with it, but you asked, would you be able to see this later? Would it be recorded? Yes, it will be. This will be downloaded. It will go on to YouTube, and you will be able to see it then. Probably that won't be until today or tomorrow when I'll get that done, but as soon as it is, I'll make sure everyone who is around knows about that. Anyhow, David, you're back with us. So you froze a bit, but you're back, so it's fine. We had an anonymous question. Let me have a look. He said he looked at your H+pedia, is that what it's called? And he says it's
yes.
a good resource, but he felt it was dealing with fairly conventional futures. I've not looked at it, so I have no idea. Is it part of the harnessing process, he says, for us to get outside of those conventional futures and get other people into the conversations who can use their imagination to see how those futures can be a benefit to us all and improve democracy, in fact?
So I would push back a bit on that. I think there are some quite radical ideas included in bits of H+pedia. But if there are areas which people notice are significantly underrepresented or not represented at all, then the people are welcome to create an account for themselves. It's a completely free, straightforward process, exactly the same as you create an account on Wikipedia and start making a small edit or creating a new page. And there is information on H+pedia about how to do that, in fact. Or if you prefer, drop me a note and I will check out whether new pages and new ideas need to be included. The project has slowed down a bit for my liking. It was going quite well for most of the first 15 months of its existence. It's slowed down a bit for various reasons in the last 3 or 4 months, and I'd welcome the chance to boost it again. Having said that, if there are better locations in which there is better structured information, I don't want to duplicate it. I'd rather people then would look there instead.
Okay.
Yes. I have a question for you. It is Ivor from America. He is saying they are free to do a lot of things, including to contribute to political campaigns. So his question is that why would people who gains a lot from this status quo, why would they agree with you on Politics 2.0?
So some people who are doing very well out of the existing system, why would they want to open up the discussion to a wider, more open field? Indeed, there are people who are worried about this and who push back against it. There's always been people pushing back against improvements in democracy. People were reluctant to give the votes to wider groups of people. People were reluctant to give votes to women, and so on. So we have to win that argument. We have to say, actually, it's the same as in technology. Most of the smart people don't work in your company. And so no matter how smart your company is, it will benefit if it's able to access intelligence outside of that company as well, via open APIs or open source or other systems. And we also have to point out to people, the same as has been made by a very wealthy writer, Nick Hanauer, who described himself as one of the 1% of the 1%. He was one of the first people to invest in Amazon long before Amazon became well known. He's done very well as a result, but he has written articles saying, you know, as 1% of the 1%, we have to, in our own self-interest, ensure that there is a more equitable distribution of goods. Otherwise, it'll be a repetition in a way of what happened in the time of the French Revolution. You know, people will rise up in one way or another. And we are seeing this rising up already. We are seeing lots of people doing increasingly dangerous, mad things. It's like what I illustrated with so-called Moore's law of mad scientists, the risk of angry, upset people doing some really damaging things. So how do we avoid that? In part, it's by moving to a better system of distributing the fruits of society and a better system of involving everybody in the conversation. So some people may not think that's right. They may think they can try and suppress the growing conversation. They may try and knuckle down on the 1% dominating. We have to win that argument that it'll actually be better even for the 1% if we move to a wider embrace of technology.
It's quite interesting because little sort of debates coming up on here on question and answers. I don't think they're debating with each other, but they're two interesting views. I mean, what you're talking about, David, in a way, is quite a complex system. And some people are saying, well, maybe only people who can understand this system should vote. I mean, should they pass the test in understanding before they vote, or should they pay a fee? Should there be a cost to participate? Whereas Pamela McLean is saying, no, what we need to do is get people involved in critical thinking. We need to develop the whole electorate in thinking critically about what we do. Now, where would you stand in that debate? How do we move on to get people to understand this in a critical way?
Well, I 100% support what Pamela is saying. We can all too easily decide that people shouldn't be voting because of a bad experience in a meeting. As Winston Churchill is alleged to have said, the 5 minutes of discussing with the working class is the best argument against democracy. I've misquoted that in some ways. Not that he argued, of course, against democracy, but it's all too easy for us to quickly form the wrong opinion of somebody's suitability to vote. But if you do get to know people better, frequently we end up being very positively surprised at their sophistication and what's going on in their mind. So if they're angry and upset, or if we are angry or upset, then our voting may be a poor choice, the wrong decisions. So we have to equip all of us by education, by intelligent assistance, as it were, by the equivalent of what we have already. You know, sometimes when we're about to click on an email, our computer says to us, you probably shouldn't click on that email. It's spam or it's phishing. Are you sure you know what you're doing? So increasingly our intelligent software may speak up to us and say, have you thought of this? Have you thought of that? And so everybody's ability to understand the issues should grow. I'm very fearful of restricting it just to people who've got wealth, who can buy, or who have passed a particular test, because I think that's going to just generate more and more anger and a lopsided set of conclusions.
Okay, we're getting very close to the end of it now. Let me ask you one final question. In your opinion, your intuition, what do you think the future will be? Will it be one where we do see the wisdom of the crowds and better citizen democracy? Or will it be one where we see more restriction, more control, and companies like Cambridge Digital that you mentioned actually being able to monitor and program every aspect of our decisions and our behavior?
Well, it's up for grabs. Both these futures are possible. I think the positive future is more likely than the negative future because I see so much evidence of people, men and women of goodwill in every walks of life, who want to push for a more equitable, more intelligent, more science-based solution. But equally, I can see lots of bad factors pushing the other way. So there's some positive evidence from the recent Dutch election and the recent French election of a desire for a more open society. But, you know, this is still on a knife edge, and we have to highlight what this positive vision should be like. And if we just stick at the level of, you know, better politics will boost our GDP, or better politics will give us higher employment statistics, I don't think that's going to be enough. That's going to not be enough to motivate people. We have to have a more, a richer vision of what that future will entail. So my richer vision is not a full employment, but a full unemployment, if you like, with the essential tasks of work being done by automation, including increasingly sophisticated, intelligent automation, which will leave each of us more freedom to not to work for a living, but to be creative, to play. And I need to flesh out that vision and flesh out the vision. It's about human flourishing rather than about human wealth. If we get the discussion more on that, we might get people more inspired. We might get more people involved in pushing hard for this more open society rather than leaving it in the hands of the 1%, the other vested interests.
Okay, well, thank you, David. I mean, I think that was a fantastic presentation. That was really good questions and really good answers. And someone's actually said the best webinar to date. And I won't embarrass him by saying who it was, but thank you, Evan. Anyhow, it was a really good webinar, and it opens up a lot of discussion that I hope we're going to take up in this next year when we look at how we do politics better. Politics 2.0, I think, is something we must take up further again, and maybe do something later in the year, maybe several events on that. So thank you for what was a very good explanation in the beginning of what I hope will be a year-long discussion around these issues.
Indeed, it's the beginning rather than an end, and a lot of these ideas are a bit rough and ready. So I thank the audience for their patience as I've tried to squeeze too much into one event. I look forward to finding better ways to describe this in the weeks and months ahead, and sharing a more understandable version of it and more actionable as well.
Anyhow, thank you, all of you, for joining us. Thank you, Phong, for helping with the questions. And again, thank you, David, for taking part. So we'll end the webinar now, and I'll stop recording. So good night, everyone.